For a Viking crew, fresh water wasn't just a convenience, it was life itself. A longship might carry between 30 and 60 men, sometimes more. Each of those men needed roughly 3 to 5 litres of fresh water every day, just to avoid dehydration. That's over 150 litres a day for a small crew. Multiply that by a journey of 2 weeks and you're talking about thousands of litres of water, all stored on a wooden ship. Now you might wonder, why not just drink the ocean water? But seawater is a cruel trick. Its salt content is far higher than the human body can process. Drink it, and your body starts losing water faster than you can replace it. You'll become dehydrated, weak, and eventually delirious. The Vikings knew this well. Even when they started a journey with clean river or spring water, the problem wasn't solved. Stored water, especially in warm conditions, quickly turns stale. Bacteria multiply. Algae forms a green film on the surface. In a matter of days, your precious supply could taste foul or make you sick. Imagine being a Viking rower, desperately thirsty, holding a ladle of water that smells like swamp water, but knowing you have no choice but to drink it. This problem wasn't unique to the Vikings. Every pre-modern sailor struggled with it. But the Vikings faced some of the harshest environments: frigid seas, rough storms, and long stretches without landfall. For them, careful planning was as vital as bravery. A chieftain or ship leader had to calculate not just how many men could fit on a ship, but how much water each would need, and how to keep it from spoiling. So what did they do? The answer starts with one of the most humble yet critical tools on the Longship: the barrel. The barrel was the beating heart of Viking survival at sea. Unlike modern containers, barrels in the Viking Age were works of skill, crafted by specialised artisans called coopers. Coopers were as important as blacksmiths in Norse society, because without barrels, ships couldn't carry enough food or drink to make their long voyages possible. Viking barrels were made from durable woods like oak or pine. The staves, the long curved planks, were shaped to fit snugly together. Instead of nails, the tension of iron hoops held them in place. The wood itself could swell slightly when filled with liquid, creating an even tighter seal. To prevent leaks and rot, the Vikings often coated the inside seams with pitch or tar, both waterproof and antibacterial to some degree. Before a journey, barrels were filled with clean fresh water from wells, rivers, or natural springs. This was often done the morning of departure to ensure freshness. But the Vikings knew that time was their enemy. Even the best sealed barrel would eventually produce stale, sour water. To combat this, they sometimes added charcoal, or birch bark, to their barrels. Charcoal, especially from hardwoods, acts as a natural purifier by absorbing impurities. Birch bark, rich in natural oils, may have had antimicrobial effects. But there was a second reason barrels were crucial. They weren't just used for water. Vikings would pack multiple barrels with a mix of water and ale, allowing them to rotate supplies. When the water started to turn, they could rely on something safer: alcohol. Ale wasn't just a drink of celebration for the Vikings, it was an everyday necessity. In fact, throughout much of medieval Europe, weak beer and ale were the main beverages people drank because untreated water from wells and streams was often unsafe. The Vikings took this logic to sea. Before departure, crews brewed large batches of small beer, a weak ale with a low alcohol content, enough to kill bacteria but not enough to intoxicate the crew. This ale was stored in barrels alongside water and often lasted much longer because fermentation made it resistant to spoiling. Ale also provided calories, which was critical for rowers burning immense energy each day. A Viking pulling the oars for 8 hours under the summer sun needed both hydration and sustenance, and ale offered both. Mead, a drink made from fermented honey, was also carried, but it was far rarer and reserved for leaders or special occasions. Mead required precious honey, and was not the everyday drink of the average crew. Instead, the ale was rationed carefully, with each man receiving a small portion throughout the day, balancing hydration with discipline. Still, no crew could rely on ale alone. It wasn't possible to bring enough barrels to last a month-long journey, which is why the Vikings looked to the sky and sea itself to replenish their supplies. If a ship's water supply ran low, the crew had to improvise. The most reliable source? Rain. Vikings collected rainwater whenever storms passed overhead. Sails were repurposed as giant catchment systems. They'd stretch the sail or animal hides to funnel rainwater into barrels, or directly into skins. A good downpour could provide enough water to last another few days. In colder waters, Vikings also relied on ice and snow. Not all ice is salty. In fact, multi-year sea ice, ice that has frozen and melted repeatedly, loses most of its salt. By breaking off chunks and melting them in pots, they could produce clean, drinkable water. Another tactic was refilling at rivers and lakes during coastal stops. Trading and raiding journeys often followed river routes in places like modern-day Russia or England. The first task upon reaching shore was often to refill barrels, sometimes even at spear point, if locals resisted. These tactics made a Viking ship far more versatile than many medieval vessels. The combination of clever storage, brewing, and opportunistic refilling allowed them to cross distances other cultures couldn't. But even with these strategies, the most dreaded scenario was always looming. What if the water ran out? Imagine being days from shore with an empty barrel. The sun beats down, the crew's lips crack from dryness and their strength wanes. This was the nightmare every Viking feared. When water ran out, strict rationing began. A few spoonfuls might be handed to each man. Leaders and rowers were often prioritised because the ship's speed and safety depended on them. Historical records from other medieval sailors describe desperate measures, and it's likely Vikings faced similar hardships. Crews would soak grains in whatever little water remained to make thin gruel, stretching out hydration as long as possible. They might chew on leather straps or even wet pieces of cloth to keep their mouths from drying out. A water shortage could spark tension or even mutiny. After all, a crew of 30 strong, hungry, and dehydrated warriors was not known for patience. This is why Viking leaders who failed to plan water supplies were often remembered as incompetent or cursed by the gods. To avoid such disasters, every aspect of life on board was influenced by water rationing, from meals to morale. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the shipboard kitchen. Cooking at sea was simple but required water. A typical Viking meal on a voyage might be dried fish, barley porridge, or flatbread made from stored grains. Barley, one of their staples, needed boiling in water to become edible. Dried meat or fish was often soaked in water before eating to make it less tough. This meant every pot of food consumed valuable water. Imagine the debate. Should we cook a filling stew or save that water for drinking? A good captain had to judge when to prioritise morale and warmth over strict hydration. Water was also needed for basic hygiene. While Vikings were known for being cleaner than most medieval Europeans, their ability to wash at sea was limited. A quick rinse of hands or wiping sweat from the face might use precious drops that couldn't be spared. Balancing water between drinking, cooking, and other needs required careful planning. But as we'll see, this balance was not just practical, it was part of a survival philosophy. Ale was both a saviour and a risk. A crew that drank too much could become sluggish, distracted, or prone to mistakes during navigation or battle. Too little ale, and they risked drinking foul water or going without fluids altogether. Ship leaders had to determine a strict rationing system. Water was typically saved for the youngest or weakest members of the crew. The strongest rowers might get ale instead, both for hydration and energy. This dynamic created a hierarchy on board. A man trusted with the key to the barrel, sometimes literally, was a vital figure. Disputes over who got the last ladle of ale were not uncommon. In harsh conditions, these arguments could even turn violent. The balance of water and ale was not only practical, but psychological. A sip of ale could lift spirits during a miserable rain-soaked day just as much as it could quench thirst. When we talk about how Vikings stored water, much of what we know doesn't just come from sagas or medieval writings, it comes from the ground. From ship burials, wrecks, and archaeological digs, we've been able to piece together how Vikings managed the logistics of life at sea. Some of the clearest evidence comes from the Gokstad ship, discovered in Norway in 1880. This ship, buried around the year 900, was found with remnants of wooden barrels scattered across its deck area. These barrels were not decorative, nor were they ceremonial. They were practical tools, designed for carrying water, ale, or other supplies. By examining the size and shape of these barrels, researchers have been able to estimate how much liquid a Viking crew could carry at a time. Most barrels were large, but not so large that they couldn't be moved. A typical Viking barrel found in these sites could hold between 80 and 120 litres, enough to keep a small crew hydrated for a few days. The iron hoops around these barrels were carefully forged, and some even showed signs of tar residue inside, confirming that the barrels were waterproof to preserve their contents. The Oseberg ship, another famous Viking find, also contained wooden buckets, tubs, and smaller casks. While some of these were likely for food storage, many were clearly intended for liquids. Their design, wide at the centre, narrow at the top and bottom, allowed for maximum capacity, while still being easy to secure, with ropes or wedges to prevent rolling during rough seas. Even smaller archaeological finds provide insight into Viking water practices. Fragments of wooden staves, preserved in bogs or burial mounds, match the construction style of barrels used in other parts of Europe during the same period. These similarities show that Viking coopers were using advanced techniques, on par with the best craftsmen of their age. There's also chemical evidence. In a few cases, archaeologists have discovered traces of organic residue in Viking barrels, tiny remnants of the liquids that once filled them. Through testing, they've confirmed the presence of plant-based compounds and even faint signs of fermentation. This suggests that some barrels were used for ale or beer, while others held fresh water. Shipwrecks along the coasts of Denmark and Sweden add another layer of understanding. In preserved wrecks like the Skuldelev ships, the positioning of barrels suggests they were stored near the keel, where the temperature stayed cooler and the movement of the ship was less severe. This placement would have helped keep the water from spoiling as quickly and made it easier to ration during long trips. But barrels weren't the only method of liquid storage. Archaeological digs at Viking trading towns like Hedeby and Birka have revealed clay vessels and leather water bags, which were likely carried alongside barrels as portable drinking containers. These were smaller and used for day-to-day sips, while the main barrels stayed sealed until necessary. What's remarkable about this evidence is how it transforms our view of Viking voyages. Too often we imagine these journeys as spontaneous raids, but the truth is they required meticulous planning and supply management. A single longship might carry weeks of carefully stored water and ale, all arranged to balance weight and ensure easy access. Without this level of organisation, their daring raids and cross-continental trade routes would have been impossible. This attention to storage shows that Vikings were not only fierce warriors, but also logistical masterminds. Their ships weren't just weapons of war, they were floating ecosystems designed to keep dozens of men alive and functioning in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. The Viking approach to drinking water wasn't just about quenching thirst, it was about survival through foresight, discipline, and adaptability. Their success in reaching distant shores, from England to Byzantium, depended not just on their skill with axes or sails, but on how well they managed the most basic human necessity: water. What can we learn from them? More than you might think. First, preparation was everything. Viking captains knew that without carefully planned water supplies, even the mightiest ship would fail before it left the fjord. Barrels were crafted weeks or months in advance, checked for leaks and treated with tar to prevent spoilage. The crew relied on their cooper as much as their navigator. In a way, every successful raid on Lindisfarne, or trading journey to Russia, began with a simple question: do we have enough to drink? Second, the Vikings understood the importance of redundancy. They didn't rely on a single solution. Water was stored in multiple barrels to prevent total loss if one went bad or was damaged during storms. They brewed weak ale not just for taste, but as a backup, an early example of risk management at sea. This system of layered preparation was one reason they could travel farther and longer than many of their contemporaries. Third, they valued resourcefulness. When conditions changed, they adapted. If rain came, they harvested it. If ice floated nearby, they chipped it off and melted it. If they docked at a strange riverbank, they refilled their barrels, even if it meant sending armed warriors ashore to secure the water source. This relentless ability to improvise kept them alive where others might have perished. There's also a lesson in discipline. Water was rationed carefully, with the crew drinking small measured portions each day. Unlike modern times, where we take clean water for granted, every sip a Viking took was deliberate. The ship's leader decided who drank, when, and how much. In those harsh conditions, leadership meant life or death. One careless man who spilled or wasted a barrel could endanger the entire crew. When you think about it, this system shows us that the Vikings had an advanced understanding of logistics. We often imagine them as wild, impulsive raiders, but in truth, they were strategic planners. You don't sail from Norway to Iceland, or from Denmark to Constantinople, without precise knowledge of your resources, your route, and your survival needs. And finally, there's a broader lesson for us today. The Vikings remind us that survival is not about technology, but mindset. They crossed brutal seas without desalination, GPS, or metal water tanks. Their success came from preparation, teamwork, and the understanding that every resource, especially something as basic as water, had to be valued and protected. In modern times, where clean water flows from a tap with no thought at all, we've lost some of that appreciation. The Vikings lived in a world where every drop mattered. It's a reminder of how fragile survival can be when we're removed from the systems we take for granted. Their story also speaks to resilience. A Viking crew didn't fear hardship. They expected it. They prepared not just for battle, but for the quiet, creeping dangers of thirst and starvation. In doing so, they created a blueprint for survival that remains inspiring even now. The next time you fill a glass of water, think of the Vikings, sailing across hostile seas with barrels of liquid life strapped to their decks. Their success was not just because of their weapons or ships, but because they mastered the most fundamental challenge of all: how to drink safely in a world of salt water and storms. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more deep dives into history, and join me on our next journey into the lives of those who came before us. The Vikings didn't just survive, they thrived. And sometimes all it took was a good barrel of water.